votes remain to be counted. There are voices that were waiting to be heard. Across our state, folks are opening up the dreams of voters in absentee ballots, and we believe our chance for a stronger Georgia is just within reach.
With just over 60,000 votes separating Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp, Abrams insists the race is way too close to concede. Kemp, on the other hand, has taken a victory lap and resigned as Georgia Secretary of State, claiming the total 20,000 provisional ballots yet to be counted in the governor's race are not enough to trigger a runoff. But Abrams, who has spent much of her career combating Brian Kemp's voter suppression efforts, says there are thousands of additional absentee and other ballots left, and she is vowing to stay in the race until every single vote is counted. Joining me now is Mayor Theresa Tomlinson of Columbus, Georgia, Karine Jean-Pierre of MoveOn.org, and Jason Johnson of The Root. I'm going to go to Theresa first, and just noting for the audience, there's like a 2-second delay, just for FYI. So, Theresa, just what do you make of this argument by Brian Kemp that there are not enough votes still out there for Abrams to be still in the hunt?
Well, she needs just over 20,000 votes to have a recount, which would be very helpful, actually, so we could know what exactly the vote count was on Tuesday. And she needs about 25,000 votes to force a runoff. Kemp has been saying all along that there's only about 22,000 votes out there. Of course, a lot of folks doubted that he actually knew. And it turns out just from Freedom of Information Act requests, open records requests, we call them in Georgia, that the Abrams campaign has found a little over 30,000 ballots that are out there. So we suspect there are in excess of 30,000 ballots out there to be counted. But the most important thing is, Joy, we just had record turnout on Tuesday. 4 million people voted for governor in the state of Georgia. That's the largest midterm election turnout we've ever had. And one of the reasons people turned out is because we swore to them that their voices mattered, that we were going to count their votes. And so we have that obligation, and this is far from over. It will not be certified, thanks to the federal courts, until Tuesday at the earliest.
Yeah, and just to stay with you for a moment, Mayor Tomlinson, what happened? I mean, Stacey Abrams was well ahead in the polls consistently throughout. How did we get here? I suspect I know the answer, and I suspect it's going to be unnerving and sort of tragic, but what do you think happened to reverse what had been a pretty consistent polling lead for Stacey Abrams?
Well, the polls were actually fairly tied, and Stacey had pulled ahead a bit. There were really positive indicators in that early voting that it looked like, in fact, she was going to pull ahead on Election Day. The African-American vote was off the charts. We were seeing urban vote turnout, and where she needed it outside of the Atlanta area, we were seeing very large turnout as well. And then, of course, the disappointment of Election Day, those initial returns now. So there's several things that happened. One, the Abrams campaign had a huge absentee ballot effort. So a lot of her ballots are actually in those absentee ballots that were set aside because of the exact match, the signature requirements. Of course, we had a federal court insist that those ballots be counted and that those that there were any questions about be counted as provisional ballots. So the courts took care of some of that. But there has been broad-scale questions of voter suppression, most certainly. A ton of concern out there, not enough voting machines, predominantly in Democratic counties. Just a lot of concern, and this is something that's really plagued the Brian Kemp tenure as Secretary of State. And so you can imagine why people were particularly offended on Wednesday when he went into the governor's office, declared himself the victor, and then chose to resign for political optics, I might add. The woman that was appointed by the governor to be the acting Secretary of State, Robin Creighton, is a Yale law graduate, an African-American woman. Ability to lead in some fashion, although she was the head of the Department of Human Services, which talent skills don't necessarily correlate to this job. But why in the world was she not appointed 6 months ago, 5 months ago, so we could have saved ourselves this serious question?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go to you, Jason Johnson. You've been covering this race very early on, and I think the big glaring spotlight on this race was about Brian Kemp's long history of voter suppression, very sort of open, not like brazen voter suppression. Before the 28-term midterms, he put 53,000 ballots on hold, as Mayor Tomlinson mentioned, from 2012 to 2016. Georgia, under Mr. Kemp, purged 1.5 million voters just in 2017. 665,000, almost 665,800 people purged. That's 10%, 1 in 10 registered voters. And since 2012, 214 polling places have been shut down under this guy. He essentially bioengineered an electorate that would be essentially with enough white voters and few enough voters of color to elect him.
Right. And here's the thing, Joy. That's what he did before Election Day. Then we know the things that Brian Kemp did in the last 2 weeks before the election. The court said, hey, look, all these people that you remove through exact match, they're allowed to vote. You have to inform local constituencies and districts that those people can vote. He didn't do that. You had what happened in Snellville. Probably the most egregious example was Snellville, right, where you had a 3-hour delay because they didn't have power cords for voting machines. Power cords in Georgia, where Home Depot was founded. They didn't have power cords. These are the kinds of things that Brian Kemp allowed to happen. And I've heard from a lot of people who say, well, this has to do with the local agencies or the local voting places. No, it was his job to make sure. He had one job, and that was to make sure that this election worked functionally. There is absolutely no way and no reason that he should have been able to do what he was able to do and then bounce out. And I think what's really key as we go into these sort of recounts, and I do think, and I said this before in my prediction, I think that they're going to go to a runoff. The state Democratic Party sent out a really funny tweet, and they said the way Brian Kemp is acting, it's like saying, I'm the lottery commissioner, I won the lottery, but I'm not going to show you my winning ticket, right? I mean, he's literally been delivering information only to himself throughout this. And I am very, very proud of the fact that the Abrams campaign, look, she isn't just fighting for herself and the people who voted for her, but her campaign allowed 2 other congressional districts to get flipped. Her campaign allowed other seats to be won in the state. This is a template for how to win in the red South. Yeah. I'm glad that she's fighting the way she is.
And Karine Jean-Pierre, I think because Kemp has been so brazen, I wonder, as an activist, as somebody who leads an activist organization, what then is the response if Brian Kemp, having done all of that, then becomes the governor of an important state like Georgia, a state where Coca-Cola is headquartered, a state where Atlanta exists, where the Super Bowl is headed its way? How does the nation then look at a state like Georgia, which was always distinguishing itself from the history of a place like Mississippi, even though it has the same history, but it sort of supposedly has emerged as this sort of modern South? If a guy like Kemp can do all of this and then still be governor, then what does the activist community do? I mean, you could ask the same question about DeSantis, given the way he ran his campaign in another important state like Florida. What is the activist community going to do in response if that man becomes the governor of Georgia?
I think we keep fighting. It doesn't end. It doesn't end here at all. I have to really just highlight what Jason Johnson said. It's so true. Stacey Abrams has been remarkable because she's been doing this for 5 years, fighting Brian Kemp, the man who basically pickpocketed Jim Crow and turned this election into a voter suppression election. He has been blocking African Americans from voting for some time now. He and his allies have put roadblocks. They have been trying to deny African Americans from their right to vote. And she has been fighting, like I said, about 5 years in 2013 with the New Georgia Project. So she has definitely laid for us a vision of how do you fight this? What do you do? And not only that, Georgia, I believe now, is going to be a swing state in 2020 because of Stacey Abrams. And so this has really been quite just amazing, unprecedented what we're seeing, but we have to continue to fight. It doesn't stop. And we have to help Stacey Abrams. I do believe that she's going to get into a runoff. We're so close, 20,000 votes, 0.4% to get there. And all of us just have to be all hands on deck and help her get to that win in the runoff.
Well, I mean, I guess the small piece of good news is that Brian Kemp won't be running the runoff, but we just don't know what he left behind in that office to, try to ensure himself the governorship. It's pretty brazen and pretty astounding. Mayor Tomlinson and Karine will be back in our next hour. Jason Johnson, thank you very much. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
And